Chris McGrew with TTG Equipment, Service Manager at the Logansport, Indiana location. Today we're going to talk about a 2016 S680. What we're going to cover today is just a couple general maintenance items, maybe a couple field settings, some things that maybe we want to keep an eye on before we actually make our way to the field and to make sure we don't run into any problems on our first day out. What we're going to cover will also kind of end up encompassing a larger range of machines as well, but this is particularly going to be more of your 5-speed feeder house Pro Drive transmission machine. Okay, and so as we start at the front of our machine, first thing, main kind of powerhouse up here on the feeder house, we got our 5-speed reverser right here. So these are a little bit different compared to what you've had on previous machines. This is just a fixed shiv, and you got a 5-speed transmission up here located behind the cab that actually shifts that back shaft speed. So you don't have any variable shivs down here to grease. If you were working with a different style S-series machine, maybe like an S680, you would probably have a high torque reverser. Those high torque reversers actually do have a variable shiv cam set up inside there, and there are 2 grease zerks on those shivs that require daily greasing. If you look in your operator's manual, depending on how far back you go, it may reference maybe a 50-hour grease zerk. They've since changed that. They want that done every 8 hours. So as you look at those variable shivs on this reverser, you'd have one at 12 o'clock and you'd have one at 2 o'clock. And you want to make sure you're putting 5 to 6 pumps in each grease zerk. That's going to basically prevent those cams from generating enough heat to kind of lock up. And then once that happens, it ends up chewing that V-shaped drive belt that you have through here with your upper variable shivs as well. But again, this is your 5-speed feeder house style. So standard 80-90 synthetic gear oil down here in this reverser. Up here at the top, this is just kind of it's just all it is a fixed idler pulley, no variable shivs, nothing, no hydraulic cylinder to worry about up here. The bearings inside that pulley right there are JD 118. The reason we know that part number is because they're very common to fail. It's non-greasable sealed unit. We do see a lot of hot spots being generated from this area just because you do have some shielding in this corner, and it allows some of that chaff and debris to get kind of plugged up in there. And if you do develop a hot spot from one of those bearings getting a little dry on you, you could be facing a potential problem there. So we really harp on guys to go ahead and be proactive and maybe changing those every year or at least every 500 separator hours for sure. One additional thing we want to go ahead and cover, we want to make sure we're keeping an eye on these single point connection hookups up here. We got these 5 hydraulic couplers. Undoubtedly, it seems like on the older machines, probably prior model year 16, we had an issue where those things would constantly end up being blowing seals. You'd end up with that hydraulic leak that come down on this shield, maybe it ended up getting on this actual drive belt here. We want to try to avoid that. We want to keep a good eye on this. As soon as we see some dust collecting in this area, we want to be pretty proactive about getting those changed out. If you're a customer with an older combine moving to a newer style head, there actually is an updated relief valve kit that gets mounted on the head or gets mounted inside the valve block underneath the single point connection hookup, and that prevents those seals from blowing out as often. They've since changed some things on the hydraulics on these newer heads to alleviate some of that. So again, we want to keep that oil off this belt. It's going to promote some slippage, generate some more heat transfers, and we don't like that. Next thing we want to go ahead and talk about, and this is kind of your machine setting stuff. Don't forget, drum down for beans, drum up for corn. This is still a model year 16 machine, so it's got the 3 individual chains. As you go past model year 16, you get into the situation where we're back to having 4 individual chains for our conveyor chain here on the front side. So you'll have actually 4 idlers up top rather than 3. What that style is going to do is prevent you from stretching out that middle chain with all that blanket of material flowing in through the feeder house here. So a couple benefits there. Moving our way back from the feeder house, we're going to come back to our feed accelerator. This is going to be the first point of crop contact. Before the season gets going, we want to go ahead and crack this bottom door open at least, or even we got the top cover we can take off, pop the belt off this feed accelerator drive pulley. We're going to spin this over and look through here, make sure we don't have any damaged vanes or missing plates. What that's going to do, if you do have missing plates or damaged vanes, it's going to throw this feed accelerator out of balance, and you're going to feel that pretty hot and heavy in the cab. So just to make sure we got a good even feed of material being thrown into the front side of that rotor, we want to make sure all these serrated wear strips are in place. They got a decent sharp edge on them. They don't have to be sharp and crisp. Guys that are doing seed beans actually prefer a little bit of a worn out surface there rather than a good sharp corner. Just a little bit more gentle on the crop coming in through there. As long as they got serrations on there, it's still going to grab material and pull it through and feed it into that rotor. Deere does have a back swept feed accelerator plate option for those seed bean guys, just because, like I said, it is significantly gentler on the crop as it's being fed in there. So we just want to make sure we're laying our eyes on this before the season gets started, make sure it's cleaned out, make sure it's all actually in good shape and balanced. This transition door that goes from the feeder house to the feed accelerator, this hinge plate here does have a tendency of getting worn out. And when you look at it, you'll start to see part of the hinge actually show through. Once this plate gets worn down smooth enough, it'll be worn in a W. If you let that go too far, you'll actually have two decent sized holes that a lot of that crop material can leak out of. So again, just laying our eyes on it, making sure we don't have an issue that shows up there at the beginning of each season. Okay, making our way back to our residue disposal system back here. This is our advanced PowerCast tailboard. We got an extra fine cut chopper back here with hammer knives. Difference between hammer knives and regular chopper knives: hammer knives have the wings on them. Just puts a little bit extra kind of vacuum on all that dust and everything. It does a good job of really demolishing that stalk and cob material, especially in viney beans. They do a pretty good job of getting everything minced up so it can kind of break down a little bit faster. Your PowerCast tailboard there, they are independently adjustable. A lot of guys maybe don't take full advantage of that. Good windy day, or maybe if you're coming up right against a residential area and you want to throw that trash away rather than throwing it in the back of somebody's yard to avoid a potential phone call, you can slow this guy all the way down and speed it up and try and throw all that stuff clear to the right. A lot of guys have taken advantage of that and maybe diminished the risk of upsetting the neighbor. So something to keep in mind. We look back here, we got these plates that bolt in on both of the PowerCast tailboard spinners there. We want to take those out for corn, put them back in for soybeans, especially if you're getting into using like a 40-foot flex draper or even a 45-foot head. You want to keep those plates on there so it kind of just helps throw that material out just a little bit further, so you're getting a good, complete coverage out of all that residue. Take them out for corn though, because you will find the actual stock material will get wedged in between these spinners. And if you can imagine that cob material riding all the way and that guy all the way out, that's where you start seeing some wear show up out here on the end of those spinner paddles themselves. So just be taking them out for corn, putting them in for soybeans. I got some guys that take them out and leave them out. Kind of customer preference. As long as you're happy with what the residue disposal system looks like, you can about make it work either way. Hammer knives, again, they're non-flippable. So basically what we're looking for is once that wing, basically once the blade after the wing rather is kind of worn down to a fine point, and you actually start to see the dimension of the knife start to shrink a little bit, that's when you definitely want to go ahead and replace those. I see a lot of guys start to replace them as soon as some of that carbide coating starts wearing off there, and it's probably a little premature, honestly. As long as the hardware is still tight, you don't have a lot of lateral side-to-side movement coming out of those blades, it's still going to chop material. Now granted, if they are dull, it is going to take a little bit more horsepower to turn, but a lot of that horsepower requirement is going to come from that knife bank position. The further you have that knife bank position slid up in there, the more power it's going to take to chop all that stuff out. Again, that knife bank needs to be out for corn and slid in for beans. That doesn't mean it needs to be slid in all the way. If you slide that guy all the way in, you're going to have a nice fine confetti looking chaff from your bean stubble coming out, but you can probably do the same job only having it slid in halfway as well. So something to be mindful, something to play with a little bit. Sometimes all the way in isn't necessarily better. Okay, and then now we're making our way inside the machine. Directly in front of the chopper, you've got your discharge beater. This is where all your chaff material coming out of that rotor housing is going to come flowing through. Again, same setup, kind of as our feed accelerator plates up front, just serrated wear strips and vanes. We want to pop that belt off that guy, and we want to be rotating that thing over before season every year. Make sure we don't have any missing vanes, missing hardware, any sort of rock damage. Because again, this thing gets out of balance, it's going to put quite a significant vibration in the machine that you're going to feel all the way up in the cab. So we want to be laying our eyes on that, making sure that's all cleaned out and good to go. Next thing we want to look at is the discharge beater grates on the bottom side here. Basically, it looks like an old style concave setup on maybe a Walker machine. It's got these nail looking pins in there and actual cross dividing plates, so you kind of get some final threshing action happening right here. So any remaining grain that may make its way through that discharge beater, you're going to get to fall down onto this return pan, and that thing's shaking fore and aft the whole time, slowly throwing that stuff back up towards the front to land on your pre-cleaner. Okay, and then directly beneath our return pan, coming off of our shoe auger bed there in the very front, you've got your pre-cleaner, and then the front of your chaffer, and below your chaffer you've got your sieve. So our pre-cleaner, we want to make sure we're doing a very good job of cleaning that out each season. Maybe you run into a situation where you got down corn. We saw that a couple years ago. That pre-cleaner in the front of this chaffer shoe is going to plug up with a lot of dirt, dust, and debris, and it's going to take some work to get that stuff chiseled out of there, especially if it's allowed to dry. In the event that mud makes its way in there, all you're doing is plugging off the avenue for that grain to make its way down to that cross auger for the clean grain elevator to get in the grain tank. So we want to make sure everything's able to flow through there very easily, or else basically you're just cutting the capacity down on the machine. Come towards the front of the chaffer here, which is this bottom section, you've got a nose piece up there. We've, again, in that mud situation, we found where mud is actually able to make its way around the front of that chaffer shoe and collect right above the cleaning fan housing. Now when that mud would collect there and harden, this whole shoe is still going fore and aft, and all it's doing is crashing the front of that chaffer into that hardened mud. So we want to make sure that's cleaned out, because if not, you can imagine what starts doing to that nose piece of that chaffer. It starts denting it in, and then now you've got an avenue for that free grain to make its way down into the cleaning fan. A lot of guys have called in the past complaints about, everything seems to be going okay, but I still notice I got quite a few beans showing up in my cleaning fan, or I got quite a bit of corn showing up in my cleaning fan, which translates directly to losses. And all that is that front transition piece got a little bit of damage to it, or there's a seal up there as well that could be damaged, and it just allows that free grain to make its way out. If it's not in the grain tank, it's not making you any money. We all know that. This style chaffer is called a dual zone chaffer. The front portion of the chaffer is still adjustable from the cab using our touch set control settings. This rear section back here is actually manually adjustable. It's got a rod back here that takes a 10mm wrench, and you can manually set this depending on where you want it. The reason they came out with a dual zone adjust chaffer is because they made the cleaning shoe about 70% longer on these machines compared to our 70 series combines. What was happening is a lot of that free grain still coming through this discharge beater that maybe would have been the nubbins on the end of the cob, stuff like that, was coming through here and landing directly on top of this rear section of this chaffer. Well, once that happened, we started to see a lot of cob material making its way down to the tailings. Active tailings just kind of mesh it up, and then it ended up being dumped back on top of the return pan, make its way towards the front. Now you got a bunch of cob showing up in your grain tank sample. So with the dual zone adjust chaffer, we're able to shut this down just a little bit tighter, so we're still getting some of that free grain that may make it through that discharge beater, but we're doing a little bit better job of filtering that cob material out. Just cleaning up that sample quite a bit for you. Guys that maybe grind their own feed, have their own cob mill or have their own mill, basically. If you're running into issues where you're still getting cob in your sample, you can go ahead and close down that front chaffer just a little bit more compared to what the actual recommendations are on your slide card or in your book. I've had some guys running the chaffer all as tight as 17 or 18 to get that cob material pulled out of there. Now, guys that maybe are more interested in eliminating all losses possible, they go ahead and end up opening this rear zone up just a little bit further than what they actually got their chaffer set at. So that way, if any sort of material is going to make its way through here, any sort of free grain, it's going to have the opportunity to get picked up and shoved down into that active tailing system and dumped in on top of that return pan. So this is where you as the operator kind of get to pick and choose how you want to set the machine, how you want it to work for you. So a couple of adjustments that a lot of guys maybe don't think about, they kind of just set and forget, but you can actually end up modifying to get it to work for you or against you if you're not careful. Okay, and so then making our way back towards the front right hand corner of our machine here, we got that horizontal shaft that's actually driving the shoe augers there. This is a slip clutch out here on the end of that guy. We want to make sure he's in good operating condition. That slip clutch starts going off, you start losing all motion from those shoe augers. It doesn't take a very long time at all for that to end up chewing up that horizontal shaft and ruining the bevel gears and everything else. So we want to be proactive, making sure it's in good shape. So pop that belt off, give it a spin over. There's also an access hole right here you can look into and look at the bevel gears on the front of those shoe augers and the actual bevel gears on the horizontal shaft itself. So with that belt off, give that guy a rotation over there, see how much movement you got coming out of those bevel gears, indicating whether maybe you got some shaft keys that might be getting worn, things like that. But again, stuff we can do pre-season to kind of prevent any sort of downtime. Making our way back up here, again, you've got that intermediate jack shaft here that's driving your feed accelerator and shoe auger shaft and cleaning fan back here. Up here on the feed accelerator, you got these two very large bearings on either side. They are greasable. Make sure we're hitting those. Hitting back in here is actually a grease zerk that is going to your rotor bearing. So you've got a very large rotor bearing on the front of that rotor itself. That guy somehow gets missed. It's a 400-hour grease zerk. I'm telling guys, go ahead and do yourself a favor and hit it once a week. Just a couple pumps is all it needs. And a lot of times what will happen is the grease line from this grease zerk going to that rotor bearing, mice, rats, whatever, will chew it in half. So then you may think you're greasing it, but it's not actually getting there. If that front rotor bearing goes out, you're going to know it. You're going to have a thud constantly while that thing's rotating. If it fails completely to the point where the balls fall out of the races, then you start getting a little bit of chattering because that rotor's moving around there beating on that concave housing. So again, something we want to be mindful of, make sure we're inspecting. Go ahead and put that rotor in neutral and spin it over, make sure it sounds smooth. If it's got any sort of noise to it at all, probably a good indication that front rotor bearing's failing on you. Then we got this radial pin style slip clutch up here. So you've got your shaft coming out of your reverser to drive this right hand side. This then goes inside to drive the conveyor chain through this feeder house drive chain here on the right. This radial pin style slip clutch can have 2 to 4 grease zerks on it. This one has 2. We want to make sure we're greasing both of them. If you just grease one side, you know, that's great, but it's not going to actually migrate all the way over to the other side for the radial pins. And if you don't get grease to both sides, it could force one end to basically lock up, and then you're kind of direct drive. You got nothing to give in the event you get something adjusted inside that feeder house. Come down here, we've got this is actually how we're going to end up adjusting our conveyor chain speed. So you've got this is the driver, so right now you've got it set on slow. The small sprocket would be slow, the large sprocket would be fast. There are different combinations of these sprockets you can get depending on how fast you want that conveyor chain to run. A lot of guys like to slow everything down significantly for corn. There is a different combination out there that gives you an even smaller sprocket so you can slow it down. Your seed bean guys especially, they'll go ahead and try and slow it down as well, just to try and be a little bit more gentle with that machine. You know, the first point of threshing essentially happens here as that crop hits that chain. That's when you start seeing some of that free grain. So if we can slow it down, just be a little bit more gentle, it's not a bad idea. I hope you found this video, this 2016 S680 helpful. As always, if you guys have any questions or comments or need further assistance from any of your local dealers, please feel free to reach out to any of us. You can also find us on ttgequipment.com. My name is Chris McGrew. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.